Vodo-Siosk Baas versus General Grievous is typically regarded as a mismatch due to Grievous's commonalities with Exar Kun. His baseline Jarkai technique was extremely similar to what Kun displayed on Dantooine, while his quad-saber technique resembled the Trakata saberstaff that Kun unveiled on Coruscant, and he heavily favored the style-shifting tactic that contributed to Kun's victories in both engagements. However, after seriously examining it, there is a lot more to unpack here. Despite his disadvantages, Vodo Baas was still one of the top-tier combatants of his era, with physical anatomy and a range of martial proficiencies shockingly similar to Grievous himself. My analyses of Jedi Weapon Master Vodo-Siosk Baas will be drawn from his primary appearances in the 1993 Tales of the Jedi comic series and the 2005 audio drama, in addition to his character sheets in the Power of the Jedi Sourcebook and the Jedi Academy Training Manual. My analyses of CIS General Grievous will be emphasizing his appearances in pre-2008 Legends continuity, specifically the original Clone Wars multimedia project that lasted from 2002 to 2005, ignoring the Clone Wars animated series and anything produced under Disney. For those who don't already know my reasons, TCW's portrayal of Grievous is woefully inconsistent, typically underpowered, and his multiple redundant fights with Obi-Wan Kenobi muddled the continuity and cheapened Kenobi's victory in Revenge of the Sith. Moving on.
If you're to succeed in combat against the best of the Jedi, you must have fear, surprise, and intimidation on your side. For if any one element is lacking, it would be best for you to retreat. You must break them before you engage them. Only then will you ensure victory and have your trophy.
From the top, Grievous was a Kalish male who had been subjected to a total cybernetic reconstruction. His heart, lungs, brain, and eyes implanted into a heavy-duty droid chassis built for hard combat, consisting of armor-plast plating mounted on a duranium frame. His arms could split lengthwise into an extra set, his clawed feet could cling to surfaces and handle weapons, and all of his limbs possessed an omnidirectional range of motion. However, as a Kravaki, Vodo-Siosk Baas was effectively a natural biologic version of Grievous. A sapient crustacean, he also possessed an exoskeleton and 6 tentacle limbs, typically using 2 as arms and 4 as legs. On the one hand, Grievous's overwhelming advantage in regards to strength, stamina, and durability was palpable, but on the other, Baas could match his range of motion and his extra limbs, and also possessed external plating in the form of his exoskeleton. Clearly insufficient against a lightsaber, but moderately effective against blunt physical strikes. However, Grievous's clawed hands and feet could rend metal and crack armor. Though Baas wouldn't be put off by Grievous's bizarre anatomy given how closely it mirrors his own, he can't compete with Grievous's output or resiliency, leaving his potential success predicated wholly on his armed combat skill. The question this raises is how effective Vodo-Siosk Baas's force-imbued quarterstaff would be against General Grievous's droid chassis. Given that Baas has been observed shattering stone with the weapon, he's clearly packing more than just a wooden stick, but Grievous has tanked telekinetic blasts, sonic blasts, and electrical blasts from both energized bolas and an electrostaff. What it's actually taken to crack his shell have been focused force crushes and targeted force throws, and the only Jedi to pull off either is Mace Windu. If the force attack delivered by the quarterstaff is tightly focused, it could be potentially devastating, but if it's delivered more broadly, Grievous could probably soak it up with minimal damage. All that being said, repeated blunt strikes with an electrostaff proved instrumental in allowing Obi-Wan Kenobi to penetrate Grievous's shell and expose his vulnerable organ sac. Furthermore, it's not like Baas didn't carry a lightsaber. In fact, he quite literally taught a course on lightsaber construction. Despite the limitations of his weapon, Vodo-Siosk Baas employed a delicate defensive technique extremely similar to those of Obi-Wan and Count Dooku, and possessed a range of proficiencies that prepared him for everything Grievous was bringing to the table, at least on paper. Baas was a Jedi weapon master, an exotic weapons specialist, and the teacher of the renegade Nyman master Exar Kun. Much like his fallen apprentice, Baas's skill set emphasized alternative weapons training, consisting of traditional lightsaber combat, twin weapon combat, and staff fighting. His experienced technique was geared towards executing disarms and throwing opponents off balance. Furthermore, given the possibilities offered by Force weapon and the examples set by Jedi Master Skyweli and the Sith Lord Saj Calician, Baas leveraging his anatomy to quad-wield improvised weapons is not out of the question. Unfortunately, all of these same tricks were what Vodo Baas came up short against in Exar Kun, and all of these same tricks were staples of General Grievous's style. Despite contending well with Exar Kun's baseline single saber technique, Baas was blindsided and put on the defensive in both of their major engagements when Kun abruptly resorted to twin saber combat. Breaking out an additional blade to surprise opponents was one of Grievous's primary tactics, occasionally starting off with one blade to set up for Jar Kai, often seizing loose weapons in his feet for tri-wielding, while keeping his extra arms in reserve for both quad-wielding and physical grapples. Furthermore, Kun's dual saber technique was extremely similar to Grievous's, and his saberstaff technique was superficially similar to Grievous's quad-saber technique. With twin blades, Kun's use of power moves to pound on Baas's defenses until his weapon failed closely matched Grievous's takedown of Shaak Ti on Hypori, while the dexterous attack flurries Kun employed with his saberstaff resembled the weaving integrated sequences Grievous unleashed when quad-wielding. Even Kun's Trakata counters, described in the original guide to weapons and tech, were emulated by Grievous through other means, such as the feinting lightsaber toss he used to blindside Kakruk. Grievous's baseline Jar Kai technique is already extremely well suited to overpowering Vodo Baas's defenses, and an abrupt shift to quad-wielding is potentially devastating. However, there is one situation where I could see Weapon Master Baas coping with what the Biodroid General is bringing on, and that is if Grievous approaches Vodo-Siosk as he did Obi-Wan, and opens with quad-wielding. Why I believe Exar Kun's Trakata Saberstaff style was so effective is because Kun kept it in reserve to surprise Baas, and because the dual-phase archaic Saberstaff was practically several weapons in one, the variable blade lengths meaning that the weapon's reach and dimensions never stayed consistent. Despite the aggressively randomized nature of Grievous's quad-saber attack sequences, his blade lengths remained consistent, and as I discussed earlier, the Krivaki would not be put off by quad-wielding alone. Furthermore, Grievous tended to rely on pure saber combat with all four blades out, the feints and physical combat integration that I believe would be most effective against Baas, only coming up in TCW. Given how similar Baas's technique is to Dooku and Kenobi, he is very well suited to keeping Grievous at bay long enough to suss out his style and start delivering disarms. As General Grievous was a non-force wielder, he was incapable of directly resisting telekinesis, and has been force disarmed several times, creating another situation where Weapon Master Baas's dual-wielding proficiency may come up. However, I believe that this is the only relevant application of Baas's force abilities. The only other telekinetic attack that he has been credited with was the basic force push, which Grievous can easily tank or evade. Otherwise, Master Vodo specialized in mental powers intended to detect and neutralize dark side influence, which are completely useless here because Grievous can't touch the Force. Interestingly, Grievous was aware of the blood transfusion he had received from Jedi Master Sifo Dyas's corpse, and was secretly ashamed that it hadn't conveyed Force sensitivity. To compensate for this, Grievous relied on fear tactics to distract and intimidate, which made for an intriguing commonality with Vodo Baas, as both employed forms of psychological projection to subvert opposing Force wielders. Ultimately, General Grievous's effectiveness was heavily predicated on psychological warfare, the Dun Mok tactics he learned from Count Dooku. The Biodroid General's chassis was explicitly designed to resemble a Krath war droid, which had been deployed against the Jedi on Deneba, and are something that Master Baas would be familiar with. Between this, his Kravaki physiology, with his exoskeleton and 6 tentacle limbs, and his range of proficiencies as a weapon master, Baas is much less likely to be caught off guard by the more extreme components of Grievous's style. Furthermore, Baas's lack of familiarity with Grievous means he isn't aware of the fearsome reputation that Grievous worked so hard to build, and so has no pre-existing fear of him. Given that Vodo Baas remained resolute in the face of certain death against Exar Kun, I think it's fair to say that Grievous has no chance of intimidating or cowing the old master. Though these factors mean that the Kravaki Jedi is much more of a threat to the Biodroid General than previously believed, Grievous still has all of the necessary advantages to maintain the dominant edge. Baas's Kravaki physiology may be anatomically similar to Grievous's droid exoskeleton, but his ability to match Grievous's speed is debatable, and Grievous is clearly stronger and tougher. Baas's quarterstaff would be effective as a defensive implement, but its offensive viability is questionable, and it will break down in an extended engagement. Baas may share Grievous's multi-weapon proficiency and favor a conservative technique extremely similar to Dooku and Kenobi, but as repeatedly stated, he has a proven vulnerability against abrupt style shifts and elaborate feints. Lastly, Baas's emphasis on neutralizing dark side influence means that most of his powers aren't even applicable against Grievous, the sole exception being telekinesis. However, though Baas has never deployed the lethal telekinetic strikes that are required to disable Grievous, his application of Force Disarm is almost certain to come up, as Grievous has no defensive barriers to neutralize it. By extension, not only does this mean that the breakdown of Baas's quarterstaff isn't necessarily fatal, as he can replace it by stealing one of Grievous's lightsabers, but it also means that Baas's dual weapon proficiency is almost certain to come up. Either Baas takes up 2 lightsabers, or he Gandalfs it with blade and staff. Unfortunately, between Grievous's physical supremacy and his extensive experience and training, I think he is prepared to deal with this. Baas is doing everything right, but he doesn't possess Kenobi's endurance, he lacks Dooku's familiarity with Grievous, and he is susceptible to feints and trickery. Moving on to my projection for how this fight would play out, the closest analog for how they stack up against each other would be the final duel between Old Ben Kenobi and Darth Vader. while the progression of the battle would resemble Khausen Darak's experience contending with Vindican and Malgus. The early fight would match Darak's opening bout with Vindican, both combatants probing one another's fighting styles while keeping their full might in reserve. Grievous's escalating offensive in the mid-fight would mirror the challenge posed by contending with Vindican and Malgus together, and I have no doubt that Vodo Baas would do as Darak did and appropriate an extra blade. The late fight would mirror Darak's final one-on-one bout with Malgus, as fatigue would be taking its toll on the Jedi Master, while the tireless Jedi Hunter would be pulling out all the stops. Vodo Baas's best shot at winning is in the mid-fight, his probable use of improvised or appropriated weapons potentially allowing him to disarm Grievous and strike his chassis. Unfortunately, given his performance in both of his serious fights against Exar Kun, Grievous's first stage of escalation would likely be effective for putting Baas on his back foot long enough to wear him out. Vodo-Siosk Baas is ultimately in an extremely awkward position, in that his developed skill is sufficient to pose a threat to Grievous, but by forcing Grievous to take him seriously, he's provoking an assault that he's not prepared to weather. He's doing everything right, but he's simply too flimsy. I declare General Grievous the obvious victor.